The sound was wrong. Not the soft scrape of shovel against dirt and rock that had become the rhythm of his life, but a dull metallic thud that vibrated up the wooden handle and into his bones. 12-year-old Samuel Morales froze, his breath catching in his throat under the oppressive Arizona sun. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes as he stared at the ground beneath the ancient saguaro. For weeks, this patch of land they called El Jardín del Diablo had offered nothing but thorns and hunger for him and his little sister, Rosie. With trembling hands, he dug away the remaining soil, revealing the corner of a rusted metal box. It was not a treasure chest from a storybook. It was grim, solid, and real. Prying the lid open with the edge of his shovel, he saw them. Neat, tight rolls of old currency and a leather-bound diary. There was no shout of victory, no cry of joy. Samuel simply sank to his knees, the dry desert dust puffing up around him in a silent, suffocating cloud, the weight of their survival finally finding an anchor in the forgotten earth. This single, quiet moment of discovery is the culmination of a journey fueled by desperation and a promise a young boy made to himself. It is a testament to the idea that sometimes hope is not found, but unearthed from the driest ground. If you believe that stories of resilience and hidden kindness deserve a voice, please take a second to leave a like on this story and subscribe to our channel so you do not miss what happens next. We love hearing from our community, so let us know in the comments where in the world you are listening from today. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful narratives to life, and this is a story that truly deserves to be heard until its very end. But to understand why finding a box of money in a cactus-choked wasteland felt less like luck and more like an act of profound, long-overdue justice, we must go back. Our story does not begin here, under the desert sun with dirt on Samuel's hands. It begins 2 months earlier, in the cold, sterile air of a county lawyer's office in Phoenix. It begins with the echoing pronouncement of a single word that stripped Samuel and his 7-year-old sister Rosie of everything they had ever known, leaving them vulnerable and alone in a system that saw them not as children, but as a problem to be solved. It begins the day they were officially and unceremoniously declared orphans. The 2 months that followed were a long, slow lesson in the color gray. The walls of the temporary state-run home in Phoenix were gray, the thin, scratchy blankets on their narrow cots were gray, and even the food seemed to carry a gray, listless taste. For 12-year-old Samuel Morales, the world had been drained of its vibrancy the moment his mother took her last shallow breath. Her passing, just 8 months after a mine collapse had stolen their father, had plunged him and his 7-year-old sister Rosie into a silent, colorless world managed by strangers. The home was not cruel in an active way, it was something far worse. It was indifferent. The air hummed with the quiet drone of fluorescent lights and smelled perpetually of industrial cleaner, a sterile scent that tried and failed to erase the faint, underlying odor of collective sadness that clung to every room and every child who walked its echoing halls. Samuel quickly learned that his age was now just a number. In his own mind, he was no longer 12. He was the keeper of memories, the guardian of a 7-year-old's fragile heart, and the sole barrier against a world that saw them as files in a cabinet. He moved with a deliberate slowness, a conscious effort to take up space and project a sense of stability he did not feel. His shoulders, thin and boyish, felt perpetually tense, as if bracing for a blow that never came but was always expected. He would hold Rosie's small hand, not just for her comfort, but for his own. The warmth of her grip a tiny living anchor in the cold, impersonal sea of the state's care. He watched her constantly, monitoring her for signs of the same deep ache that had settled permanently behind his own ribs, a hollow space where his parents used to be. Their days fell into a monotonous, unyielding rhythm dictated by bells and schedules. Wake up at 6:30, breakfast at 7, where they ate lukewarm oatmeal in silence at long formica tables. Schoolwork with a tired-looking tutor until noon. Lunch at 12:30. 2 hours of recreation in a fenced-in yard where no one ever seemed to play. Dinner at 5. Lights out at 8. There were no bedtime stories, no goodnight kisses, no one to check for monsters under the bed. The only monsters in this place were loneliness and the suffocating fear of the future. Samuel fought back by creating a small, invisible world for him and Rosie, whispering stories of their father's strength and their mother's laughter into the darkness long after the final bell had rung, trying to rebuild their home with nothing but words. Into this grey existence walked Garrett Holloway, the Pima County lawyer assigned to their case. He visited them once a week, always dressed in a crisp suit that seemed out of place in the drab facility. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, his words smooth and polished, but his sympathy felt rehearsed. Samuel learned to watch his eyes, which were small and quick and never seemed to align with the sad smile on his face. Holloway would talk about legal proceedings, about estates and guardianships, using a vocabulary that Samuel could only partially grasp. He presented himself as their only guide through this confusing new landscape, the man who held the keys to their future, and yet with every visit, the cold knot of dread in Samuel's stomach tightened. He did not trust the man's practiced kindness. It felt like a mask, and he was terrified of what might lie beneath it. Rosie, too young to understand the legal complexities, but old enough to sense the emotional currents, would shrink behind Samuel whenever Holloway appeared. She would clutch the back of his shirt, her small face buried in the thin fabric, as if trying to make herself disappear. Samuel would place a protective hand on her head, a silent signal that he was there, that he would not let this man or this system harm her. After Holloway left, the real work would begin. Samuel would spend hours calming Rosie's frayed nerves, distracting her with hand-clapping games or drawing pictures on scraps of paper with a stubby pencil he had found. These were the only moments of color in their grey world, brief flashes of a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away, a life where they were not orphans, but simply a brother and a sister. It was during one of his visits that Holloway first mentioned the property, the only thing their parents had left them. He described it as a 2-room adobe house on a useless patch of land near Tucson, rendered worthless by the obsessive planting of their great-grandfather, Sebastian Morales. The man, according to Holloway, had choked the property with thousands of cacti, creating a thorny, impenetrable fortress nicknamed El Jardín del Diablo. The lawyer's tone was dismissive, painting the land not as an inheritance but as a liability, another problem to be managed. He made it sound like a curse, a final piece of misfortune left to them by a strange and foolish old man. Samuel listened quietly, filing the information away, a seed of doubt planted in his mind. That doubt began to grow in the quiet hours of the night. Samuel lay on his cot staring at the water-stained ceiling and tried to reconcile Holloway's words with the fragmented memories he had of his father. He remembered his dad talking about the land, not with shame, but with a strange kind of respect. He had called it a place of secrets, a place that protected itself. He remembered his father tracing lines on an old map, his finger stopping at the small plot of land, a wistful look on his face. Why would he speak with such reverence about a place that was worthless? The discrepancy was a small, sharp stone in Samuel's shoe, a constant irritation that he could not ignore. It was the first sign that the story Holloway was telling them was not the whole story. He clung to the image of his father, a man whose hands were calloused from work, but whose touch had always been gentle. He could almost smell the scent of copper dust and desert sun that had clung to his work clothes. He remembered his mother, her voice a soft melody as she sang traditional songs while cooking, the scent of fresh tortillas filling their small home. These memories were both a comfort and a torment. They were proof of a life filled with love, a life that had been stolen from them. They were the fuel for his quiet determination. He was the son of a strong miner and a loving mother, the great-grandson of a man who had built a garden of thorns. He would not let their legacy be erased by a man in a cheap suit with empty eyes. The system was designed to make them feel small and powerless, to grind them down until they accepted any fate offered. Other children in the home moved with a resigned quietness, their spirits already dimmed, but Samuel possessed a core of stubbornness inherited from his father. He felt the weight of being the last Morales, the protector of their name and their history. This feeling was magnified by the $15 their mother had carefully saved and hidden in a small envelope. He had found it tucked inside her favorite book and now kept it pinned to the inside of his pocket. It was not just money. It was her last act of love, her final provision for them. It was a tangible piece of her belief in their future. Every day, Samuel felt the walls of the state home closing in. The sterile environment was a constant, oppressive force, designed to strip away individuality and replace it with compliance. He saw how easily he and Rosie could be separated, sent to different facilities, their bond severed by a bureaucratic decision. The thought was a physical pain, sharper than any hunger or loneliness he had ever known. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he could not let that happen. He was the only family Rosie had left, and she was the only one he had. They were a two-person tribe, a tiny island in a vast, uncaring ocean, and he would do anything to keep them from being swept away by the tide. This growing resolve was a silent rebellion taking root in the desolate soil of his grief. While the other children drifted through their days, Samuel observed. He watched the staff, noted their schedules, and learned the building's layout. He listened to every word Holloway said, searching for inconsistencies, for weapons he could use. He was no longer just a grieving boy. He was becoming a strategist, a survivor. The oppressive quiet of the home, meant to pacify, instead sharpened his senses. It gave him the space to think, to plan, to nurture the fierce, protective love he had for his sister into something that could withstand the coming storm. He did not know what the future held, but he knew he would not face it passively. He would fight for their right to remain together, to honor the memory of the family they had lost. The true nature of the storm arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet rustle of paper. During what Garrett Holloway called their final administrative meeting, he slid a thick stack of documents across the polished surface of his desk. The gesture was smooth, practiced, a motion he had clearly made hundreds of times before. He called them adoption papers, framing his offer to take both Samuel and Rosie in as an act of profound charity, a lifeline in the bureaucratic sea that threatened to swallow them. His voice was a soft, reasonable drone, explaining that this was the only way to keep them together, the only way to provide them with a stable home. But there was a condition, presented as a mere formality. In exchange for his guardianship for this selfless act, they would simply need to sign over the deed to the worthless property their great-grandfather had left them. It was, he explained with a sad smile, a liability that he would graciously take off their young shoulders. Samuel stared at the documents, the black ink forming a dense, unreadable wall of text. He could not decipher the legal language, the clauses and subclauses that coiled around each other like snakes. Yet he understood the stark simplicity of the final page. There were 2 lines at the bottom. One was for him, as the eldest surviving Morales, to sign away their land. The other was for Garrett Holloway to claim it. The pen Holloway offered felt impossibly heavy, a tool of surrender. The lawyer continued to speak, his voice painting a grim picture of the alternative. He spoke of the state orphanage system, not with malice but with a feigned pity, describing overcrowded dormitories and the near certainty of separation. He made it clear that their bond, the only thing they had left in the world, was a fragile thing that only he had the power to preserve. The choice he presented was not a choice at all. It was an ultimatum wrapped in the language of compassion. To give them time to consider this generous offer, Holloway ushered them out of his office and into the long, empty hallway. He told them to take a moment to understand the gravity of their good fortune. He closed his office door, but it did not latch completely, leaving a thin, vertical slice of darkness. The click was too soft, the action too careless for a man so precise. It was a mistake that felt intentional. Samuel stood in the sterile silence, holding Rosie's hand. Her fingers were cold and trembled slightly within his grasp. The only sound was the rhythmic tick-tock of a large institutional clock on the wall, each second landing with the weight of a hammer blow. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and floor wax, a scent Samuel would forever associate with the feeling of a trap slowly closing around him. Then, through the crack in the door, came Holloway's voice. It was a different voice from the one he used with them. The gentle, sympathetic tone was gone, replaced by something sharp, metallic, and hungry. He was on the telephone, and the person on the other end was clearly a business associate, not a colleague from social services. Samuel felt a cold spike of adrenaline. He instinctively tightened his grip on Rosie's hand and pulled her slightly behind him, using his own small body as a shield against the words he knew he was not supposed to hear. He tilted his head, not wanting to move closer and risk being seen, but straining to catch the predatory cadence of the lawyer's new voice. The man on the other side of that door was a stranger, and Samuel suddenly felt a primal need to understand the danger this stranger represented. The words that bled through the opening in the door were fragmented at first, but they quickly formed a terrifyingly clear picture. Samuel heard phrases that had no place in a discussion about two orphaned children. He heard, "a land developer from Scottsdale, untapped water rights, and a private geological survey from the 1920s. Holloway was not talking about a useless plot of land choked with cacti. He was discussing a hidden treasure. He spoke of the Morales family with a dismissive, mocking tone, describing their great-grandfather Sebastian not as a man, but as an eccentric old fool who had, through sheer dumb luck, built his thorny fortress on top of an aquifer worth millions. The cold, transactional nature of the conversation stripped away any illusion of care, revealing the raw, unvarnished greed that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. The betrayal became absolute when Holloway specifically mentioned the old survey, boasting that he was the only one who knew of its existence, that it had been buried in the county archives for nearly a century. He then let out a low, dry laugh, a sound completely devoid of warmth or humor. It was the sound of a predator confident in its kill. He spoke about the ease of the acquisition, how he would secure the deed from two scared, uneducated kids who would be grateful for a roof over their heads. Hearing himself and his sister described in such a way, as obstacles to be managed, as ignorant pawns in a game they did not even know they were playing, ignited a cold fire in Samuel's chest. This was not a rescue, it was a robbery, a sophisticated theft of their past and their future, orchestrated by the very man entrusted to protect them. Then came the final, crushing blow, the deadline. Samuel's entire body went rigid as he heard Holloway lay out the timeline to the developer on the phone. "I've given them 48 hours to sign the papers," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with confidence. "They have no other choice. If they refuse, the transfer request to the state gets filed first thing Monday morning. By this time next week, the boy will be in a facility in Flagstaff and the girl in a group home down in Yuma." The threat was no longer a vague shadow. It was a detailed, brutal plan. The separation he feared most was not just a possibility, it was Holloway's leverage, the weapon he was holding to their throats to ensure their compliance. The ticking of the clock in the hallway was no longer just a sound, it was the countdown to the end of their world. The sharp click of the receiver being placed back in its cradle was followed by a silence more terrifying than the conversation itself. In that quiet, Samuel felt the floor drop out from under him. He pulled back from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at Rosie, who was watching his face, her own expression a mirror of his dawning horror. She didn't understand the words, but she understood his fear. The lawyer's office, with its polished wood and leather-bound books, suddenly felt like the most dangerous place on earth. It was a cage, and the man inside was not their savior, but their jailer. Every path forward seemed to lead to a dead end, every option a different kind of loss. A moment later, the door swung open, and Garrett Holloway stood before them, his mask of gentle concern perfectly restored. The transition was so seamless, so complete, that it made Samuel feel physically ill. The lawyer's eyes crinkled into a benevolent smile as he placed a heavy hand on Samuel's shoulder. The touch was meant to be reassuring, but it felt like the weight of a tombstone, pinning him in place. "So," Holloway said, his voice once again smooth as silk, "have you two had a chance to think about my very generous offer? It's the best and only path forward for you both." Samuel could not speak. He could only manage a small, jerky nod, the lie catching in his throat like a shard of glass. He was looking into the eyes of the man who was actively planning to shatter his life. As they were escorted from the building and back into the blinding Arizona sun, the world outside seemed unreal. The sounds of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant wail of a siren, it all felt like it was happening in a different reality. Samuel's mind was consumed by the echo of Holloway's words and the relentless ticking of an invisible clock. 48 hours, 2 days. The threat was no longer a vague, shapeless fear living in the shadows of his mind. It now had a name, a face, and a deadline. The period of passive waiting was over. The normal world, with its rules and its supposed protectors, had failed them completely. A cold, terrifying certainty settled in his soul. If he and Rosie were going to survive, they would have to disappear. The walk back to the state home was a journey through a muted, alien landscape. The vibrant colors of the Phoenix afternoon seemed washed out, the sounds of the city distant and distorted, as if he were hearing them from underwater. Garrett Holloway's voice, the real one from behind the cracked door, was a venomous echo in his mind, replaying its cruelest phrases on a loop. Two scared, uneducated kids, the boy to Flagstaff, the girl to Yuma. The words were not just an insult, they were a verdict, a sentence already passed down. A 48-hour clock had started ticking in the center of Samuel's soul, each second a heavy metallic click, counting down to the final destruction of his family. There was no internal debate, no weighing of options. The decision settled over him not with heat, but with a chilling, absolute cold. He could not fight Holloway in his world of paper and lies. He could not appeal to a system that saw him as a case file. The only move left was to leave the board entirely. They had to run. Back in the sterile grey room he shared with Rosie, the decision solidified from a thought into a physical weight in his chest. Rosie was already asleep on her cot, her small form curled under the thin blanket, one hand clutching the worn teddy bear that was her last link to their mother. Samuel stood over her, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, and the full gravity of his choice crashed down upon him. This was not a boyish adventure. It was a desperate gamble with the only precious thing he had left to protect. His fear was a living thing, a cold knot tightening in his stomach, but his love for her was a fire that burned hotter. He reached into his pocket and felt the crisp edges of the $15 their mother had left them. It was not just money. It was a sacred trust, a final, whispered command to keep her children safe. He would not fail her. In the faint, intrusive light spilling under the door from the hallway, the planning began. Samuel carefully retrieved the small cardboard box that held their father's few remaining possessions. Buried beneath a spare set of work gloves and a faded photograph of their parents, he found it, a worn, creased road map of Arizona. He unfolded it gently on the cold linoleum floor, the paper whispering in the silence. His finger, smudged with the day's grime, traced the thick red line of the highway from Phoenix down to Tucson. It looked so simple on paper, a direct path. He knew the reality would be far harder. His plan was stripped down to its bare essentials by their desperation, use their mother's money to buy 2 bus tickets, and then walk the rest of the way. He focused on the logistics, on the tangible steps of the journey, using the simple mechanics of the task to build a wall against the overwhelming terror that threatened to paralyze him. Every movement he made was infused with a new, dangerous purpose. He found a small, threadbare backpack and began to pack, his actions slow and deliberate to avoid making a sound. He packed 2 changes of clothes for himself and 2 for Rosie, rolling them tightly to save space. He added the photograph of their parents, a silent promise that he was not leaving them behind, only carrying them forward. He crept into the communal bathroom, the dripping of a leaky faucet marking the slow passage of time, and filled their single plastic canteen to the brim. The sound of the running water seemed impossibly loud in the dead of night, and he flinched at every creak and groan of the old building's plumbing, convinced that each noise was the footstep of a supervisor coming to investigate, coming to stop him before he could even begin. With their meager supplies packed, his attention turned to the enemy's movements. He sat on the edge of his cot, perfectly still, and listened. For the next hour, he became a student of the building's nighttime rhythm. He learned to distinguish the sigh of the heating system from the distant rumble of a truck on the highway. Most importantly, he timed the rounds of the night supervisor. He heard the heavy tread of shoes walking the length of the hall at 11 p.m., then again just after 1 a.m. The pattern was predictable, lazy. A long, deep silence would follow, a period of neglect that was their only true ally. He calculated that the safest window, the deepest part of the building's slumber, was between 4 and 6 in the morning. It was a 2-hour gap of opportunity, and their entire future depended on him seizing it without hesitation. For a fleeting moment as he stared at the faint outline of the window, a sliver of crippling doubt sliced through his resolve. He looked around the drab, soulless room, a place he despised more than any other on earth. Yet it was a place with a roof, with guaranteed meals, with a semblance of safety, however cold and impersonal. Was he insane to trade this for the unknown dangers of the road, for the unforgiving heat of the desert? Was he dragging his little sister into a disaster, born of his own fear? Then Holloway's words returned, clear as a bell. The girl to Yuma. He pictured Rosie's face, confused and terrified, being led away from him by a stranger. The image was a physical shock, a jolt of adrenaline that burned away every last shred of hesitation. This was not a choice between safety and danger. It was a choice between a certain end and a slim chance. The final preparations were a quiet ritual of commitment. He took the envelope with the $15 and, using a small safety pin from Rosie's sewing kit, fastened it securely to the inside of his jacket. He placed the packed backpack under his cot, where it would be hidden in the shadows but easy to grab. He laid out their sturdiest shoes side by side, ready for a journey that would test them to their limits. In these small, deliberate actions, he was shedding the identity that had been forced upon him. He was no longer Samuel Morales, orphan, ward of the state, file number 3B71. He was the protector of the Morales family, the guardian of its memories and the architect of its future. He was his father's son, and he would not be broken. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity. Samuel did not sleep. He sat and watched the thin strip of light under the door, his entire being coiled like a spring, waiting. When the luminous hands of the old alarm clock on the shared nightstand finally pointed to 4:15 a.m., his body moved before his mind could object. This was it, the point of no return. He slid off his cot, his bare feet making no sound on the floor, and crossed the small space to Rosie's bed. His heart was a frantic, wild drum against his ribs, a sound he was sure could be heard throughout the entire sleeping facility. He reached out, his hand trembling almost uncontrollably, and gently placed it on his sister's small shoulder to wake her. He whispered her name into the suffocating stillness, a single word that severed their ties to the past and launched them into the terrifying, unknown expanse of their future. Rosie did not make a sound. When Samuel's hand touched her shoulder, her eyes fluttered open, and for a terrifying second they were wide with the sleepy confusion of a 7-year-old waking in the dark. But then she saw his face, the urgency in his expression, the finger he held to his lips, and her confusion was instantly replaced by an incredible, innate understanding. She simply nodded, her small face a solemn mask in the gloom. The silence she offered him was the first gift of their journey, a testament to the unspoken bond that had become their entire world. He helped her into her shoes, his fingers fumbling with the laces in the near-total darkness, his own breath held tight in his chest. He passed her the small, worn teddy bear, and she clutched it to her chest like a shield. He then slung the single backpack over his shoulder, the meager weight of their lives a heavy burden, and with one last look at the room that had been their prison, he led her to the door. He turned the knob with the agonizing slowness of a bomb technician, every molecule of his being focused on preventing the telltale click of the latch. The metal was cold and unforgiving beneath his sweaty palm. Inch by inch, he pulled the door inward, creating a sliver of grey light, a vertical wound in the darkness. He peered into the long, empty hallway, a sterile canyon lit by a single, buzzing fluorescent tube at the far end. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a sound so loud he was certain it must be echoing off the linoleum floors. He listened for the heavy tread of the night supervisor, for the cough or the rustle of a newspaper that would signal his presence, but there was nothing. Only the low hum of the building itself, breathing its stale, recycled air. He took Rosie's hand, squeezed it once for courage, hers and his own, and they slipped out of the room, two small ghosts dissolving into the shadows. The walk down that hallway was the longest of Samuel's life. Every step was a calculated risk. He kept to the edge of the corridor where the shadows were deepest, pulling Rosie along behind him. A floorboard groaned under his weight, the sound a gunshot in the oppressive quiet, and they both froze, their bodies rigid with fear. Samuel's eyes darted toward the supervisor's station, a small glass-enclosed booth halfway to the exit. It was empty, a single dim lamp casting a sickly yellow glow on a vacant chair and a half-finished crossword puzzle. The man was likely on the other side of the building, his routine their only shield. Still, Samuel's imagination populated the empty chair, picturing the man looking up, his eyes finding theirs in the gloom. He forced himself to move again, his legs feeling stiff and disconnected, pulling his sister past the empty station and toward the double glass doors that promised freedom. Reaching the exit felt like a monumental victory, but it was a victory that brought a new, more immediate terror. These were old, heavy doors with a push-bar locking mechanism that was designed for security, not stealth. Samuel knew from daytime observation that it made a loud, definitive clank when opened. He paused, his hand hovering over the cold metal bar, a wave of paralyzing fear washing over him. This was the point of no return. The sound would alert anyone within earshot. For a single, breathless moment, he considered turning back, retreating to the relative safety of their grey room. Then he heard Holloway's voice in his mind, cold and triumphant. Flagstaff. Yuma. The memory was a jolt of pure adrenaline, burning away his hesitation. He took a deep breath, whispered, "Hold on," to Rosie, and pushed the bar with all his strength. The resulting metallic crack was deafening, a shriek of protest that seemed to shake the very walls of the building. They did not wait to see if anyone had heard. They burst through the doors and into the cool, damp air of the pre-dawn morning, running without looking back. The sudden chill was a shock after the stuffy warmth of the building, and the air smelled of damp asphalt and distant diesel fumes. Phoenix was still asleep, the sky a deep, bruised purple just beginning to bleed into grey at the eastern horizon. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to twist and reach for them as they ran. They were utterly alone, two impossibly small figures in a silent, concrete world. The feeling of exposure was overwhelming. Every passing car, its headlights cutting through the darkness, felt like a searchlight. Samuel ducked behind a row of overgrown oleander bushes, pulling Rosie down with him, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilarating, terrifying freedom. They were out. They were actually out. Crouching in the shadows, Samuel pulled out the creased road map. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold it steady. Under the faint orange glow of a nearby streetlight, he traced their path with a grimy finger. The bus station was 12 blocks away, a straight shot down a main thoroughfare, and then 2 blocks east. It seemed an impossible distance. The city, so familiar by day, was a labyrinth of menacing shapes and unfamiliar sounds at night. He had to make a choice: stay on the well-lit main street where they were more visible, or risk the darker, unlit side streets where other dangers might lurk. He chose the light. It felt like the lesser of two evils. He folded the map, tucked it away, and took Rosie's hand again. Her fingers were like ice. "We have to keep moving," he whispered, his voice tight. "We just have to walk fast and look like we know where we are going." The Greyhound station, when they finally reached it, was an island of weary, fluorescent light in the lingering darkness. It was a place of transience and quiet desperation, smelling of stale coffee, disinfectant, and the faint metallic scent of exhaust fumes. A handful of other travelers were scattered across the worn plastic seats, each one wrapped in their own bubble of solitude. To Samuel, every pair of eyes seemed to follow them. Every quiet cough sounded like an accusation. He felt the weight of their otherness, of their youth. 2 children alone in a bus station at 5 in the morning were an anomaly, a question mark. He steered Rosie toward a deserted corner, behind a bank of vending machines, and sat her down on the cold, tiled floor. He tried to project an aura of confidence, of belonging, but inside, every nerve was screaming that they were about to be caught. The ticket counter was the final, most terrifying hurdle. It required interaction, a direct confrontation with another adult. He left Rosie hidden behind the machines with strict instructions not to move, and walked toward the counter, his legs feeling like lead. He could feel the crisp envelope containing their mother's $15 pinned inside his jacket, its presence both a comfort and a source of immense pressure. The clerk was a tired-looking woman with weary eyes who barely glanced at him. 2 tickets to Tucson, Samuel said, his voice coming out as a reedy squeak. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing a lower, more confident tone. 2 one-way tickets to Tucson, please. The woman named the price. It took almost all of their money, leaving them with less than $1 in change. He slid the worn bills under the glass, avoiding her gaze, his heart pounding as he waited for the questions that never came. She simply printed the tickets and pushed them toward him, her indifference their greatest blessing. Clutching the 2 thin strips of paper, which felt like the most valuable objects in the world, he returned to Rosie. Their bus was scheduled to depart in 20 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. He sat beside her on the floor, the backpack between them, and began coaching her in a low whisper. If anyone talks to us on the bus, we pretend we're asleep. We lean against the window and close our eyes, okay? No matter what. Rosie just nodded, her eyes huge and trusting, her grip on her teddy bear so tight her knuckles were white. The minutes crawled by, each tick of the large clock on the wall amplifying Samuel's anxiety. He kept scanning the entrance to the station, half expecting to see Garrett Holloway or a police officer walk through the doors at any second. The air was thick with suspense, the simple act of waiting a form of torture. When the call for their bus finally crackled over the intercom, the relief was so intense it made Samuel feel dizzy. He grabbed Rosie's hand, and they joined the short, shuffling line of passengers heading out into the loading bay. The air outside was colder now, and the first hints of dawn were painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The bus was an old hulking machine, its engine idling with a deep, reassuring rumble. He handed their tickets to the driver, a large man who grunted without making eye contact, and hurried them down the narrow aisle. He chose 2 seats near the back by a large, grimy window, pushing Rosie into the seat first and settling in beside her. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on them, though he knew it was just his imagination. He pulled the backpack onto his lap, a flimsy barrier against the world. The hiss of the hydraulic doors closing was the most beautiful sound Samuel had ever heard. It was a sound of finality, of escape. A moment later, with a lurch and a groan of protesting metal, the bus pulled out of the station and onto the dark, empty streets of Phoenix. Samuel pressed his face against the cool glass of the window, watching the familiar buildings and street signs slide by, becoming smaller and more distant with every passing second. He watched until the city was just a constellation of lights in the rearview mirror, a fading memory. A profound, bone-deep wave of relief washed over him, so powerful it almost felt like grief. They had done it. They had actually done it. For the first time in months, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren soil of his heart. The 3-hour journey passed in a blur of anxious silence. True to his instructions, Rosie curled up against the window and feigned sleep, her small body perfectly still. Samuel could not rest. He sat ramrod straight, his senses on high alert, watching the other passengers, listening to the driver's intermittent chatter on the radio, flinching every time the bus slowed down. The sun climbed higher in the sky, flooding the desert landscape with a brilliant, unforgiving light. The world outside the window transformed from the urban grid of Phoenix into a vast, empty expanse of sand, rock, and skeletal-looking cacti. It was a harsh, beautiful landscape that seemed to stretch on into infinity. It was the world of his father, the world they were running toward, and for the first time Samuel felt a flicker of connection to the land that held their future. Stepping off the bus in Tucson was like stepping into an oven. The morning sun was already beating down with an intensity that Phoenix had not yet reached, the dry heat sucking the moisture from the air. The Tucson bus station was smaller, dustier, and felt a world away from the city they had just left. The escape was over, but the journey had just begun. Samuel felt a new kind of anxiety settle in his stomach. Here they had no building to hide in, no crowd to blend into. They were completely on their own, with less than $1, a canteen of water, and a 7-mile walk ahead of them. He felt Rosie's small hand slip into his, her touch a silent question. He looked down at her, trying to give her a reassuring smile that he did not feel. He unfolded the map one last time, orienting himself with the position of the sun. Their great-grandfather's property was to the west, on the other side of the city, in the sparse, undeveloped land that bordered the Tucson Mountains. The walk would take hours. He adjusted the backpack, which now felt twice as heavy, and looked at the long, sun-bleached road stretching out before them. The initial tension of the escape, the adrenaline-fueled fear of being caught, was now being replaced by a deep physical weariness and the daunting reality of their task. The city sounds faded behind them as they walked, replaced by the crunch of their shoes on the gravel shoulder and the rising hum of cicadas. The sun climbed relentlessly higher, and the fragile determination that had carried them out of Phoenix was now being tested by the raw, brutal power of the Arizona desert. The final mile of their journey was not a road, but a challenge, a declaration of war by the desert itself. The dirt track they had been following simply dissolved, ending abruptly at a formidable wall of green and spines. Thousands of cacti, planted in dense, chaotic rows, formed a living fortress. Towering saguaros stood like ancient sentinels, their arms raised to the searing sky. Bristling cholla, their needles glowing in the sunlight, guarded the spaces in between, while thickets of prickly pear formed impenetrable spiny barricades. The house was barely visible through the thorny maze, just a faint brown smudge against the distant mountains. To an outsider, it was exactly as Garrett Holloway had described, a worthless, inaccessible prison of thorns. But to Samuel, exhausted and desperate, it looked like a sanctuary, a place designed not to keep them in, but to keep the rest of the world out. He remembered his father's stories, whispered fragments about the old man, Sebastian Morales, and his strange garden. His father had never called it a curse, he had called it a lock. Holding Rosie's hand, Samuel refused to see the wall as an end. He began to walk its perimeter, his eyes scanning the dense growth not for an opening, but for a pattern. For nearly an hour they searched, the sun beating down on their necks, until he saw it, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the alignment of 3 large barrel cacti. It was not a gate, but a suggestion. He pushed aside a low-hanging branch of a Palo Verde tree and found the beginning of a path. A serpentine trail no wider than his own shoulders, winding its way deep into the thorny labyrinth. It was a path meant only for those who knew to look, a secret handshake with the land itself. The walk through the cactus garden was slow and careful, a tense negotiation with the spiny sentinels that guarded the way. The air was thick with the sweet, heavy scent of desert blossoms and the low hum of insects. After 10 minutes that felt like an hour, the path opened into a small, circular clearing, and there, in the center, stood the house. It was a simple 2-room adobe structure, its walls the color of the earth from which it was built. Decades of sun and wind had softened its edges, and a fine layer of reddish dust coated its flat roof. It was not a ruin, it was a survivor, perfectly preserved by the thorny walls that had protected it from the harshness of the desert and the carelessness of men. The shade cast by its walls was the first real comfort they had felt in days, a cool, dark promise of shelter. Stepping through the doorway was like entering another time. The oppressive heat of the afternoon was instantly replaced by a deep, cellar-like coolness. The air inside was thick with the scent of sun-baked clay, dry wood, and the faint herbal aroma of creosote bush that had seeped into the walls over the years. A single wide room served as the main living space, empty except for a stone fireplace and a simple hand-carved wooden table. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced through small cracks in the window shutters. There were no sounds from the outside world, only a profound, enveloping silence. It was the sound of safety, a quiet so complete it felt like a physical presence, wrapping around them like a blanket. For the first time since leaving Phoenix, Samuel felt his own tense shoulders begin to relax. They were home. The first 2 weeks were a harsh education in survival. The house provided shelter, but the land demanded respect and ingenuity. Samuel, guided by fragmented memories of his father's lessons, taught himself and Rosie how to carefully harvest the sweet purple fruit of the prickly pear cacti, using 2 sticks to avoid the treacherous spines. They learned to wake before dawn to collect the morning dew that gathered on the wide leaves of agave plants, a meager but life-sustaining source of water. Their days fell into a simple, primal rhythm: find food, find water, stay out of the midday sun. It was a hard, exhausting existence, but it was theirs. They were alone, but they were together. They were not a case file or a problem to be solved. They were the Morales family surviving on their own land. The constant search for water was their greatest challenge. Samuel knew the dew would not be enough forever. A memory of his father surfaced, a story about how miners would build small cisterns to capture the rare but powerful deluge of the summer monsoon rains. The idea took root. He would dig. He found an old rust-pitted shovel head in a small crumbling shed behind the house and fashioned a new handle from a sturdy mesquite branch. He chose his spot carefully, at the base of the largest saguaro on the property, a true patriarch of the cactus forest that stood in the very center of the clearing. He reasoned that any rain would run down its massive, fluted trunk and pool at its base, making it the perfect place to build their small reservoir of hope. The sound was wrong. It was not the soft, rhythmic scrape of shovel against dirt and rock that had become the new rhythm of his life, but a dull, metallic thud. The vibration shot up the wooden handle, a jarring alien note in the desert's quiet song, and vibrated deep into his bones. Samuel froze, his breath catching in his throat under the oppressive Arizona sun. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes as he stared at the ground beneath the ancient saguaro. Time seemed to stop, the world shrinking to this single patch of earth where his shovel had struck something unyielding. For weeks this land had offered them nothing but thorns and a desperate, clinging hunger. Now it had spoken back with a voice he did not recognize, a voice from deep within the earth. With trembling hands, he dropped to his knees and began to dig away the remaining soil with his bare fingers. The dirt was dry and loose, and it fell away easily, revealing the dark, rusted corner of a metal box. It was not a treasure chest from a storybook. It was grim, solid, and real, its surface pitted and scarred by its long interment. A cold wave of adrenaline and something akin to fear washed over him. He used the sharp edge of the shovel head as a lever, jamming it into the space between the lid and the box and prying with all his might. The metal groaned in protest, the sound of a long-held secret being forced into the light. With a final sharp crack of rusted hinges, the lid gave way. He stared down into the dark interior of the box, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside, protected from the dirt and moisture by a layer of oilcloth, were neat, tight rolls of old currency, bound with twine that had grown brittle with age. Beside the money lay a single object, a thick, leather-bound diary, its cover embossed with a simple, elegant initial. There was no shout of victory, no cry of joy, no sudden release of the tension that had been his constant companion for months. Samuel simply sank back on his heels, the dry desert dust puffing up around him in a silent, suffocating cloud, the weight of their survival finally finding an anchor in the forgotten earth. He had come here seeking water, a means to continue their fight for another day, and had instead unearthed the very roots of their salvation. The desert held its breath around him, the only movement the slow swirl of dust settling back to the earth. He did not touch the money. He did not open the diary. For a long moment, he simply knelt there, a 12-year-old boy suspended between a past he barely knew and a future he could not yet imagine. The crushing weight of their survival, a burden he had carried in silent solitude for so long, did not vanish, but it shifted, finding a new and solid anchor in the forgotten earth. This discovery, unearthed from the driest ground imaginable, felt less like a stroke of luck and more like an answer to a prayer he had been too afraid to whisper. It was a quiet, profound act of justice, delivered across a century by a man he had never met, a silent testament that they had never truly been forgotten. His fingers, hesitant and coated in a fine red dust, traced the embossed initial on the leather cover before finally opening the diary. The pages were brittle, the color of old ivory, and filled with a dense, elegant Spanish script that flowed across the lines with a steady, confident hand. The ink had faded from black to a deep, earthy brown, but the words were perfectly preserved, a voice trapped in time. He did not know what he expected to find, the ramblings of a madman, a simple ledger, perhaps nothing at all. But as his eyes scanned the first entry, dated in the spring of 1882, he felt a profound and sudden stillness. This was not the journal of a fool. This was the testimony of a guardian, the careful record of a man entrusted with the fate of his entire community, a man named Sebastian Morales. He read for what felt like hours, though the sun had barely moved in the sky. Rosie had fallen asleep in the cool shade of the adobe wall, her small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm, oblivious to the history unfolding in her brother's hands. Samuel learned that his great-grandfather had not been a recluse or an eccentric, but the treasurer for a Franciscan mission in Sonora, Mexico. He was a man of numbers and faith, respected and trusted by the families who had placed their life savings, their hopes for the future, in his care. The diary spoke of a quiet, ordered life, of community festivals, and the steady, predictable passage of seasons, a world of peace that was about to be shattered by the distant thunder of political upheaval. The tone of the entries shifted dramatically as Sebastian described the rise of the Porfiriato regime. He wrote of federal troops confiscating property, of bandits preying on the weak, and of a growing fear that the mission's savings, the product of generations of hard work, would be stolen. The decision to flee was not made in panic, but with a heavy, calculated sorrow. He described a secret meeting with the town elders, a solemn pact made in the dead of night. They entrusted him with everything they had, not to save himself, but to act as a living vessel for their collective future, to carry it across the border and protect it until a time of peace returned. Samuel felt a lump form in his throat. This was not greed, it was a sacred duty. The diary then detailed the perilous journey north, the constant threat of discovery, and the immense relief of crossing into the Arizona territory. Sebastian wrote of his search for a piece of land that no one else would want, a place remote enough to be ignored, harsh enough to deter casual trespassers. When he found the sun-scorched plot of land that would become their home, he saw not a wasteland, but a perfect empty canvas. And then came the central revelation, the words that reconfigured Samuel's entire understanding of his own history. Sebastian did not plant the cacti out of madness. He planted them as a living vault, a natural fortress that would grow stronger and more impenetrable with each passing year, a lock that only the patient and the deserving could ever hope to open. Garrett Holloway's mocking words, a useless patch of land choked with cacti, echoed in Samuel's mind, now sounding hollow and ignorant. He looked up from the diary and saw the garden for what it truly was. The towering saguaros were not just plants, they were sentinels. The bristling cholla were not a nuisance, they were barbed wire. The dense thickets of prickly pear were not an overgrowth, they were walls. His great-grandfather had spent 30 years of his life cultivating a deterrent, a masterpiece of natural engineering designed to repel the very kind of impatient, greedy man that Holloway represented. It was a plan so long in its scope, so audacious in its simplicity, that it bordered on genius. The old man had not been crazy. He had been a visionary. A specific passage made Samuel's breath catch in his chest. Sebastian wrote of his own loneliness, of growing old in his thorny sanctuary, knowing he would likely never see his home in Sonora again. He wrote of his hope that if peace did not return in his lifetime, perhaps a descendant, a great-grandchild he would never meet, might one day find themselves in need of this place. "I pray they have the patience to see the pattern in the thorns," he wrote. "I pray they understand that this garden was planted not with madness, but with love, a love for a community I lost, and a love for a family I have yet to meet." The words were a direct message across a century, a hand reaching out from the dust to grip Samuel's own. He gently closed the diary, the leather warm from the sun. The silence of the desert was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of his ancestor. He felt a profound connection to this man, a shared sense of duty. Sebastian had protected the past, and now it was up to Samuel to protect the future. A single hot tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek, followed by another and then another. It was not a cry of sadness or fear, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. It was the release of a pressure he had not even realized he was carrying. For 2 months, he had believed they were utterly alone, the last forgotten remnants of a broken family. But they had never been alone. Someone had been watching over them, had been preparing this sanctuary for them for 100 years. He looked over at Rosie, still sleeping, her face serene. He now understood the full weight of his father's words, that this was a place of secrets, a place that protected itself. His father had known. Perhaps he had not known the specifics, but he had understood the spirit of the land, the intention woven into its very soil. The money in the box was not a treasure. It was a legacy. It was the physical manifestation of his great-grandfather's promise, a tool left behind to ensure that the next generation of the Morales family would not just survive, but have the chance to thrive, free from the predators of the world. The diary was not just a story, it was a key. The final entry, written in a shakier hand, provided a map, a simple drawing of the property with a cryptic clue. The Thorns protect, not repel. Look for where the 5 great saguaros form a cross upon the land. The words were a puzzle, an invitation. Samuel felt a surge of purpose that had nothing to do with fear or escape. This was about reclamation. He stood up, his small frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun, and wiped the tears from his face with the back of his hand. He was no longer just a boy hiding from a corrupt lawyer. He was the heir to Sebastián Morales' legacy, and his work was just beginning. Following the hand-drawn map, Samuel found the formation with surprising ease. It was a natural landmark, hidden in plain sight, a pattern that would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Over the next week, a new rhythm established itself. He and Rosie would work together, digging carefully at the base of each of the 5 ancient cacti that formed the cross. With each new discovery, each rusted metal box pulled from the dry earth, the story of their great-grandfather's foresight grew more tangible, more real. They unearthed 11 more boxes, each one filled with the same tightly rolled currency, bringing the total to a sum that felt impossibly large, a number that belonged in a different world. Inevitably, the deposit of such a large amount of old currency at a small Tucson bank sent ripples through the county's administrative channels, ripples that found their way directly to the desk of Garrett Holloway. Less than a month after their escape, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of the world they had tried to leave behind. Holloway arrived in a clean sedan, flanked by a county sheriff, his face a mask of practiced concern that barely concealed a triumphant predatory gleam. He held a sheaf of papers, official-looking documents he claimed were proof of decades of unpaid property taxes, declaring the land forfeit, and now the property of Pima County. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the garden's thorns had not been sharp enough. But then, another figure appeared, walking slowly and deliberately from the direction of the mountains. It was an elderly Apache woman named Mrs. Gray Feather, her face a beautiful roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes holding the wisdom of generations. She was the midwife who had delivered Rosie, a woman whose family had known the Morales family for a century. She carried a simple wooden box. While Holloway postured and threatened, she calmly produced her own records, original tax receipts, stamped and dated, showing that Sebastián Morales had paid all his taxes in full in gold coin, directly to a very young county tax collector, nearly 30 years prior. The name on the receipt, signed in a youthful but recognizable script, was Garrett Holloway. The sheriff, a man who had seen his share of desert schemes, launched an immediate investigation. It quickly unraveled a lifetime of corruption. Holloway had been running the same scam for decades, using his position to systematically steal land from dozens of non-English-speaking Mexican and indigenous families, exploiting their trust and their unfamiliarity with the American legal system. His confidence had become carelessness, and the simple, meticulously kept records of an old Apache woman and the century-old diary of a faithful treasurer became his undoing. Holloway was arrested on the spot, his mask of civility finally crumbling away to reveal the petty, greedy man beneath. In the quiet aftermath, Samuel and Rosie were not returned to the cold, grey world of the state. Mrs. Gray Feather and her son Thomas, a local veterinarian, took them in without a moment's hesitation. They were not adopted into a system, they were welcomed into a family, a community with deep roots in the very land that had saved them. Their new life was one of warmth, of shared meals and stories told on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. It was a life where they were seen not as orphans, but simply as children who deserved love and protection. The weight Samuel had carried for so long finally lifted, replaced by the simple, profound peace of belonging. They never removed the cacti. Instead, they honored the legacy of the man who had planted them. With the help of Thomas and their newfound resources, they transformed El Jardín del Diablo into something new. It became a renowned nursery for rare and endangered desert species, a place that now protected life instead of just treasure. The formidable walls of Thorns, once a symbol of isolation and defense, became a testament to foresight and resilience. Samuel would often walk the winding paths his great-grandfather had created, the leather-bound diary in his hand, feeling the quiet, steady presence of the man who had planted a garden of hope in the middle of the desert, ensuring that his family would always have a place to come home.